different set of plants and animals. So Ohio was really a supermarket prehistorically, considering the types of animals. You had beech maple associations, you had hickory oak, you had prairie, and you had all the different animals that are associated with those different environments. Now glaciers aren't just big static chunks of ice laying there, they're actually rivers of ice. They originate up in Canada where it snows more than it melts, so you have a zone of accumulation. The snow actually becomes sort of plastic and flows, and along the way it picks up those black stripes are actually pieces of bedrock and other things that are plucked up from the surrounding ground, and as it comes down to the south, it gets down here far enough and it finally melts off and makes a big melted mess is what it does. So we were right near the edge of the glacier at one time, and the funny thing about glaciers is that you think everything around them is frozen, but the glaciers are so tall that when air moves down them it compresses, so you have warm air blowing off the glaciers. They call it katabatic wind, which is kind of not what you'd expect. And when it melts back, it leaves all these little kettle lakes and ponds, and it's taken over by lichens and stuff like that. In some areas that are well drained are just piles of sand and gravel and big rocks, like these big glacial rags. When you drive around and you see these big rocks in somebody's front yard, those are courtesy of the last glacier, the Wisconsin Glacier. These big granite boulders brought down here from somewhere at a place called the Canada Shield. Some of them are absolutely huge. This is one up near Sunbury. That was actually became a nuisance, so they dynamited it and got it out of the way. Here's one in front of Wharton Hall on the Ohio State campus. It's actually, it was dated about 25 years ago by scientific radiometric method. And when I was going to school, I thought I was the oldest thing on campus, but this actually beats me by a couple years. But this was radiometric dated that not this boulder itself, but the bedrock that this was formed from is somewhere near 990 million years old, plus or minus 80 million years. So some things are really old.
Yeah, 80 million.
Also, the glaciers, when they came across what's now Lake Erie, they cut out big chunks of bedrock on Kelly's Island, made these big glacial grooves. So these things are pretty powerful, and they affect the state and the environment in ways that you really don't think it would happen. This is a farm over between St. Mary's and Urbana, and you can see the green behind it is actually a big pile of sand and gravel. It's one of these big canes, and it's absolutely huge. It's about 150 feet high. You can see that it goes way on into the woods there, and it's worth 10 times more for the gravel and sand in it than all the crops that have ever grown on it. And even if you go out west of here, if you go straight down here, this is you can't see it very well. My laser pointer doesn't work very well. That's the governor's mansion out at Bexley. And if you start digging a hole under the mansion, you have to get down 175 feet before you would dig through all the glacial material that is deposited just here in central Ohio in a nice flat area. So there's a lot of it there. And one more thing it did, it filled in the Taze River Valley. The Taze River Valley one time drained a whole lot of the southeast United States, and it came up as far as Chillicothe, and then it branched off into other streams and gathered water. When the glaciers melted, this river course is reversed. But at one time, if you get out to Chillicothe and look, you got the Southern River snaking through this big, huge valley, which at one time was this paved river valley, which was probably 2 miles wide somewhere near Chillicothe at one time. And when you hear Taze Valley High School and you look at it, it's out in the middle of some flat place. Where's the valley? The valleys are buried. So that's one thing that the glaciers did to Ohio is rearrange the river system. And the Ohio River really didn't exist until the end of the last glaciation. It also created the Great Lakes that they gouged these big low areas out of the bedrock and the sand and the gravel, and they flooded and became what we can call today the Great Lakes. Now, if you go out to Washington, where things are a little bit more exciting as far as glaciers go, off to the right, please bear with me. This is Lake Missoula. What happened was glacier meltwater accumulated here. Missoula, Montana is right here at the Idaho border, and it flooded all these valleys here to the east of Missoula. And at one time there was a lake there that held as much water as Lake Superior. about 500 cubic miles worth. And what happened was this was created because the glaciers came down, they receded, they came down and they receded. Every time they came down, they blocked a little river called the Clark Fork River, named after Lewis and Clark, and it flooded these valleys, and then the glacier would leave, and this flood would ensue across the landscape. This thing emptied out, like I said, 500 cubic miles of water in a matter of about 4 or 5 days. And when it did, it created this area here called the Channeled Scablands, which today looks like the surface of the moon, but it just absolutely washed everything away. Created these big dry valleys with steep sides. They were only created by floods. These were created by erosion, like you think of river valleys around here. This is Grand Coulee, again. And up here, you can't see it very well, but this is called Dry Falls. It's as big as Niagara Falls, and there's not a drop of water going through there. And it's really mystified people for a long time. Ever since people moved to that part of the state, they couldn't figure out what caused all this. These big plunge pools and potholes and this rugged landscape looked like the moon. But it was actually these floods. And it was not just one flood, but these are called rhythmites. And these are slack water deposits of silt and stuff. And every time there's been a lake at this place, it created one of these rhythmites. So altogether, there's 28 episodes of this massive flooding at the end of the Ice Age. Meanwhile, back in Ohio, about 15,000 years ago, the landscape settled down and became a little bit more familiar to what we're used to seeing. The lichens and the moss and the wet landscape gave way to a sort of a boreal forest, or what they call a taiga forest, mostly pines, and animals started moving into it. And you can see them here. You have muskox, horses, goats, mountain goats, mammoths, mastodons, bears, bison. This is sort of a who's who of everybody that was ever alive at the end of the last Ice Age. So you get the idea that this is sort of a pristine landscape. And the most iconic of these animals are the mastodon down here and the mammoth up here. They're about as related as I am to the King of France, although they do quite look a little bit alike. Here's their skeletons. This is one in La Brea Tar Pits in California, and here's the one at the Ohio History Center. And here's the muskox crown right here that Lori helped find over in Lincoln County back about a couple dozen years ago. You look at the teeth, even the teeth are different. Mastodon teeth are flat because they eat grasses. Mammoth teeth are flat because they eat grasses. Mastodons have these big points or masts on the teeth, and so they're for grinding up stuff like sedges and branches and that sort of thing. There's other critters on the landscape as well. There are giant peccaries, this fellow right here, and this giant ground sloth. Now, he looks like a formidable critter, and it's not somebody you want to invite to dinner, but he was a herbivore and ate leaves and roots and that sort of thing. They had these giant claws that he used to dig this stuff out. And they probably weighed a couple tons, or if not more. This was on exhibit at the museum if you want to go take a look at it. There's also giant beavers. This thing's about as big as a St. Bernard. It's called Castorites ohioensis, the Ohio dried beaver. And one of them was found in north end of Columbus, up around Northern Lights Shopping Center back in the late 60s when that land was being developed for housing. And it's kind of funny to think that here's the same guy, this is what Cleveland Avenue looks like today, and Popeye's chicken is somewhere behind the elephant. And so what happened to all these guys? There's several theories about why they don't exist anymore, or why they disappeared. Some of them were hunted, and people think that they were over-hunted. And we know that they took advantage of it because here's the bones of a giant bison with a spear point at the same level, but the only way that spear point got next to those ribs was by the fact that it was used to kill the thing. They also were overexploited. We know that they used buffalo jumps, that they would direct elephant or bison to go off a cliff, and then they would sort of pick up what they needed and leave the rest. And this is a Olson Chubbing site out in Wyoming. These are all skeletons of bison that went over the jump. And when you hear that the natives only took what they needed, that's not quite true. A lot of these animal skeletons, when they examined them, found out that they weren't butchered or anything, that they were just buried so deep in this big pile of animals that they didn't have time or the need to get to all of them. There's also a theory that a comet came along and sort of wiped out all the mammoths and mastodons, but that's pretty problematic. And one of my favorites was that when people entered the New World, they brought germs with them, and they gave the mastodons and mammoths a cold, and maybe did away with them that way. But regardless of what happened to them, they all disappeared by about 10,000 years ago. We know that people in Europe were coexisting with these guys for tens of thousands of years. So if there was a disease or a cold to go around among them, you would have thought it would happen then. And they even exploited them to make houses out of the tusks and the bones and covered it with hides. They made records of what they saw. Here's a giant oryx and with a mammoth behind it. Here again, they're recorded. They sort of a menagerie of animals that you don't see. This is in France, so you don't really think that you're going to see things like rhinoceroses and lions in France, but they were there at one time. Horses, rhinos, lions, and all this other thing. Now here's somebody thoughtfully recorded what they thought was a mammoth on a piece of ivory that was found in Florida. Unfortunately, this guy found it in a box of chips, and it just so happened that he needed a lot of money about this time, and so when he found this thing, he decided he's going to sell it. He was offered like $110,000 for it or something, but when you look at it, it's got this nice mammoth with a massive mammoth with the big trunks and the legs and the sloping backbone. But it's like, here's one Charles Knight that's in the Field Museum in Chicago, a drawing of the same thing. It's like this guy got out his history book and drew whatever he wanted on that. And this is the kind of stuff that some experts want to find, and so they don't question it at all. The fact that it was carved with a piece of flint doesn't mean anything. I've got a whole brush. So anyways, we're going to talk about the case of some of these beings being found. A long time they were found, and the bones are gathered up, taken to a museum, and reassembled or something like that. So it's actually a detective story. You want to know what killed it, when it died, and the happenstances of what happened to it. Put it into the ground so that we could actually find it about 11,000 years later. So I call this CSI, I'd say, the case of the Chippewa Lake Stag Group. Presented by the Ohio History Connection. We are no longer the Ohio Historical Society. It's the Ohio History Connection. I have yet to get it right. I think that's the first time that I did. Chippewa Lake is up here in Medina County, not too far from Cleveland, and Akron, Canton, that area. And here's the lake down here, as far as you see, and here's where we found it up here. It shows up a little better. Now this was the one time on the edge of the lake, but the lake has shrunk since then. Actually, the lake filled up this whole valley at one time at the end of the last ice age, and Chippewa Lake is now just a little puddle compared to what it used to be. If you look up on a glacial map, there's Chippewa Lake, 12,000 to 15,000 years ago, right there. There's about where we found the critter, and there is the Chippewa Lake of today. Now, this was all found by a fellow named Tyler Underwood, who was doing a backhoe service to somebody, and he dug up these big bones and antlers and thought he found a moose or a giant deer or something. He didn't know what he found, but he did take the time to call somebody and ask some questions and let them know that there's something very unusual found here. And this is what he found. It was part of the antler rack and part of the skull of this object he thought was a moose, but it's actually something called a Cervalces scotti. Again, here's a moose. It's called Alces, which means the big neck. And this is what a Cervalces looks like. It's much bigger than that. It's a deer, actually, but it's as big as a moose. And here's next to a giant deer. This is the Royal Ontario Museum. And there's been several instances of these stag mooses being found in Ohio. We're about the 9th one recovered. But ours are a little bit more unusual than the early ones. We found parts of it. This is the burning tree mastodon find over near Hebron, Ohio, from 1989 or so. And we found not only the mammoth skeleton, but we found pieces of bones that belong to the Cervalces as well. So this is what Cervalces scotti looked like, maybe. We don't know that he had spots. But like I said, he's sort of like a deer, as big as a moose. And Cervalces scotti, Cervalces just means big, thick neck. Instead of just a big neck, it means the thick neck. And this is what it would look like next to a human, probably maybe even a little bit larger than this. this is how we found it. Here I am wondering, so how am I going to, where's the elevator? You know, I'm going to get down there. And he was digging deep. He was digging the clay out for some guy that owned a horse ranch that wanted this nice blue clay to line his paddock so his horse's feet don't get hurt when they run around. And so they was digging this, and it's when he found the bone. And this is what the bottom of it looked like. It's kind of hard to see, but here's gray clay, and then it's buried over a peat horizon, and then there's a sort of like an ancient lake bed shore there full of sand and gravels and little shells and that sort of thing. So here's, when you look at the dirt, you can actually read it like a book. You got topsoil here, you got the organic subsoil, you have oxidized red clay down to about 4 feet thick, blue clay, which hasn't been oxidized yet, that's why it's still blue. And then you get down to peat, about 2 feet down there, and calcareous shells about half a foot. This is what the sand on the edge of the beach looked like. It's full of these little pieces of shell and snail shells and that sort of thing. And this is what some of the peat looked like after it dried out. Here's reeds and pieces of cane and that sort of thing. And we examine the seeds and we look at it and you can find different things. These are aquatic plants. This is a coon's tail or a hornwort. These are all in the environment at the time. A common pondweed, a water nymph, bulrush, spikerush, and ironweed, which we still see a lot today. It pops out sometime after Labor Day. They're usually out in cow pastures because the cows eat them and move them around. And then there's something called St. Andrew's Cross, which is a little yellow flower. Well, this is what one of the bones looks like after it came out of the ground. That's me holding one end of it, and Bob Kotzover, the natural history curator, the historic connection, holding the other end. And it's a nearly complete bone, but when you clean it up, it looked differently. Now this is what we didn't find the whole skeleton. We found parts of the skeleton. This is what Tyler found, just the part of the rack. Then we found leg bones, different leg bones. So we didn't get any ribs. We didn't get any of the backbone. We don't know what happened to the rest of the skeleton. Of course, we didn't have all day or very much time to look for it. We only had a limited amount of time that we could use the backhoe. So we do know certain things, that it's male and died in the fall and early winter, just like deers around here have antlers in the fall and early winter. And looking at its teeth, you can tell that it's about 4 years of age. And this is what the spread of the antlers looks like, where it is, and that's about 4 feet, and then you add about another 2 feet to either side of it because the big flanges of the antlers aren't here. So this thing would have had about an 8-foot wide rack, 7 to 8 feet, which was pretty monumental. You can understand why it has to have that great big thick neck to haul around something like that. This is one of the leg bones, the femur, the distal end, which means closest to the body. And you can see that it's fractured here, and it's been gnawed on at this end, like somebody decided it was going to become lunch. Here's the other end of it, the distal end, the far end, and it's got a spiral crack to it. Green bones break in a spiral fracture, not old bones. Old dried out bones don't do that. I know by personal experience that fresh bone breaks much different than old bone. And then there's gnaw marks on the humerus of one of the front leg bones, and then this big divot here where somebody took a big bite out of it. And again, it was chewed on at one end, not the other. Teeth scratches, and here's a puncture mark where actually something bit on this hard enough to puncture the bone. These are big bones. These are like 3 inches diameter, big around as your forearm. So it would take something with a big bite to be able to do this. And again, the other end has been chewed on. So when you look in the grand scheme of things, there's predators and prey. Now this accounts for the African savanna, or your garden, or a pond, or Wall Street. There's somebody at the top, and everybody below him is subservient to him. But he's also dependent upon these people down here that all these field mice don't do something, then the raccoons don't do something, that the raccoons don't do something doesn't happen. So that the whole biosystem, when you take one part of it out, it'll collapse. This is how ideally it should work. But the long and short of it is, at the top of this heap, there's one thing that's primary over everybody else. So, we've done it. As Captain Renault would say, this is all she's dead, round up the usual suspects. So you think about who did it. There's a theory in police work now that people that report crimes were a lot of times the ones that committed them. So here's the Baywatch guy. He reported it, so maybe he had something to do with it. But we checked it out, and his alibi for October 9700 BC is pretty tight. So there's other critters that people that suspect. The dire wolf, Canis dirus. They were known to have been in Ohio at the end of the Ice Age. He had big teeth, great big teeth as a matter of fact. But these are like big giant dogs that they chew things and they gnaw, but they don't have the biting. 600 of these things. They travel in a big pack, and when they go savage animals and track in the car, they become stuck themselves.